we are the oppressed and they are the oppressors. And they want the oppressed to give more to the oppressor.
An attack here on a member of the press clearly marked as press is, of course, a violation of international law, firing tear gas where he passed out.
This deal is not a deal for peace or a peace plan. It is a war plan.
Does that justify hurting them, killing them, occupying them?
Nobody knows.
Crazy.
Welcome to The Last American Vagabond. Joining me once again today is a very special guest, Robert Inlakesh, one of the few people who is still really trying to make sure we're aware of what's going on in regard to the Israeli-Palestinian situation, the illegal occupation of Palestine, which is the reality. And this is something that is more acutely, it should be more important to most people around the world now than ever because of the so-called deal of the century and how that has, I mean, more so than anything I've seen in this topic before, been so incredibly shown to be false, an illusion, a complete fabrication. And your recent documentary, which is the focal point of today's interview, has done a really good job of laying that out and showing people why this thing is a complete lie, that this was never meant to be legitimate, that it was never meant to actually create peace. It was really meant to cause more of exactly what they're using to justify the further occupation of Palestine. And that's what I think is really solid about this documentary. As I understand it, you have another part two, which is also coming out. So thank you so much for joining us today, Robert, and we'll get into the ins and outs of this. How are you today?
I'm great, thank you, and thank you for having me.
Yeah, it's always a pleasure. As I said, I can't even think of any other person that's really doing the work you are right now on this topic, maybe save for a few others, but to shout out them later. But let's get into the topic of your fantastic documentary, which is called Steal of the Century, perfectly titled, Trump's Palestine-Israel Catastrophe. Now, this is something that those watching this channel have been very well aware of because we've been covering this as it goes along and who might have seen our previous interview with you. But I think the one thing that really stood out to me right off the bat in here that I think that I would argue is grabbing people who may not be aware of this topic now is to really beginning to see the evolution of the history, the real history that's been covered up so well, this entire process. The idea that we're really looking at Zionists illegally stealing and occupying Palestinian land all this time ago. Then we can jump forward to the Oslo Accords, where it was essentially legitimizing another land grab. And now we're at a point where we're dealing with another so-called peace deal, which is essentially doing the same thing again. So is that how you're seeing this? And what was really your motivation to just kind of grab on and make this thing now? Was it specifically the deal of the century, or maybe what you see coming after that?
Well, I've lived in and reported from occupied Palestine before. And so, of course, the issue was very close to my heart because of my association with the people there that I met and that housed me and that treated me so well. And so basically when this deal was announced, I knew that this would initiate a new round of hostilities, that Israel would continue to kill more Palestinians. That's exactly what happened when I went there in February to film the documentary. So I teamed up with my friend and cameraman, Hamdi Abdurrahman, who is Palestinian from the village of Bilain. And I wanted to show the Palestinian side of why they are rejecting this so-called deal of the century. And I wanted to show not only the Palestinian side, but the arguments backing it up in terms of international law. And also the opinion of the international community, the opinion of leading human rights organizations, and also the opinions of many who are educated on this as well, scholars, and what they've had to say about it. So I wanted to factor in all these different things and give people not just what happened when I was immediately there, but some of the context behind this, all so that people could try and push them to come towards their own conclusions, because we already know the Israeli side, we already know Trump's side. That's very much out in the open. But in terms of Palestinian opposition, what I saw on the mainstream media and what we continue to see on the mainstream media is that the Palestinians just reject and say it's an attack on their rights and freedoms and the rest of it, but that's about it. We don't get the full context because nobody tells you anything. Even if they do talk about illegal settlements, for instance, they won't tell you about the history of settlement expansion. They won't tell you about how they got there. They won't give you any context. And so the Israelis, when they come out with their arguments, it seems a lot more solid. A lot of the time they won't feature Palestinian voices as well. And so I wanted Palestinian voices in my documentary, and what I had learned from Palestinians, what they are telling me, and their sentiment to be reflected in the documentary. So you were shown the Palestinian side of why they rejected this.
Right, which is a huge part, which, as you're right, does just simply gets omitted from this discussion, as well as their presence in general from the deal itself. But but it's interesting to see this evolution of it all as well, and how at the end of the day, for me, and I think this is what your documentary did a really good job in doing, was that it focused on these parts that can be verified. Right, somebody could say, "Oh well, I don't agree with them," or I think they're this or they're that. What the point you made there is that this is illegal, right? That's not an opinion. That is the collective opinion or the collective decision of the international community. So let's start there with the point that you made. Why is this illegal? For those that may not know, why is Israeli occupation and or annexation illegal in this sense today?
Well, annexation, for one, is considered as going against, it's in violation of the UN Charter. This is, of course, heavily in violation of international law, and no one will recognize, other than the United States and Israel, that this annexation, legal annexation, I have to make the specification here. I have to make it very clear that the West Bank is already essentially annexed by Israel. The reason I say that is because an annexation is something which is intended to be permanent, and an occupation is something which is intended to end. The annexation of that land is in the fact that not only has the Israeli state never had an initiative to actually recognize it as Palestinian and create a real Palestinian state. It's never recognized a Palestinian state. It's never recognized the legitimacy of the Palestinian people, because it continues to deny the rights of Palestinian refugees, 5 million of which are scattered all over the world after the ethnic cleansing in 1948, and then, of course, in 1967. With even more people being expelled from their lands. And so when it comes to international law to do with occupation as well, this occupation is a very deeply entrenched one. And it's not only in violation of international law in terms of the way they're operating, in violation of the Fourth Geneva Convention. The Fourth Geneva Convention lays out very strictly what an occupation force is allowed to do, what it's supposed to do, and also what the occupied people are allowed to do against that entity as well, which is often ignored when it comes to Palestinian armed attacks on their occupation forces, because that's actually legal under international law to expel those occupation forces.
Something
and that's
Abby Martin's documentary did a great job of pointing out, by the way, really going into those ages and showing you, and by the way, all of which these things are covered right now, which is currently happening. Like, their actions are justified under the Geneva Conventions. Please continue.
Absolutely. And to go into it further, in the documentary, what I did across both documentaries, and the second part soon to come out, is I went into what was originally the five, they're called the final status issues. They were then isolated down to 4 final status issues. And even I don't agree with the term final status, and I'll explain why in a minute. The final status issues were the refugees, borders, settlements, and the status of Jerusalem. And when it comes to these issues, we're told, like I said, final status, as if they're supposed to be reserved for the final stages of talks, and they're so controversial that we shouldn't approach them and all the rest of this stuff. But when we look at what, for instance, the ICJ has to say, the International Court of Justice, the International Court of Justice made a very strict ruling, really. It ruled that 14 out of 15 judges, when they were making preliminary decisions, when they came to ruling whether the wall, which is built illegally into Palestinian land, usurping 12% of the West Bank, whether that was illegal, they first had to judge basically all of these final status issues. So apart from the refugee issue, and we'll go into the refugee issue in a minute. So they had to judge what Israel was entitled to have as its borders. That was one of them. It had to judge the issue of settlements, and it had to judge the issue of East Jerusalem being belonging to Palestinians. And on all of these issues, 14 out of 15 judges said, and this is the highest court on the planet, said that these are uncontroversial issues. They ruled unanimously that all in the favor of the Palestinians, that this is 1967 borders, East Jerusalem is the capital for the Palestinian people, the settlements are illegal. And even the one judge, who was the American judge, who was ruling against that, stated strictly why he did so. And he also included in his statement afterwards, addressing the settlement issue, and said settlements are absolutely illegal. So that's the highest court on the planet, if we want to judge by the judicial side of it, right? Then we can go to the United Nations, where the General Assembly has so many times you can't even count, voted year after year after year, which again is unanimous votes in favor of the solution to Palestine-Israel, which is the two-state solution in 1967, borders, East Jerusalem as a capital, just solution to the refugee problem. And that's actually including the refugees there. So that's the most representative body in the international community. And then we can go across to the human rights organizations. The human rights organizations, the two leading ones that we all know about are Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch. Both of them recognize the Palestinian right of return. And of course, this was enshrined in international law even since UN Resolution 194, which was, of course, never invoked. And this 194, UN Resolution 194, by the way, was the first ruling by the United Nations, which could have been applied to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which it never was. And so you've got the leading human rights organizations, they agree on the refugee issue. The General Assembly agrees on the refugee issue. The ICJ agrees on all of the other issues as well. And so when it comes to the opinion of all the leading bodies internationally, human rights NGOs, when it comes to the highest court in the world, and also all of the leading scholars agree on these things and acknowledge these problems historically for what they are, and know and state what Palestinians have the right to, and what is internationally recognized as Palestinian. There's these still issues that are somehow deemed as controversial, but they're not. They're completely uncontroversial, because that is the consensus worldwide.
Yeah, exactly. And this is what's so frustrating, is that it ultimately boils down to, as I made the point in the beginning, like the past versions of just essentially legitimizing the currently illegal actions they're already taking, as if that somehow is changing the situation. It's really just writing into law the current thing that only the Israeli side would be okay with. And I think that's why we're seeing this obvious pushback. And as well as the fact that I love that you pointed this out. And this is what this is the kind of thing that I think shows you that most people either see the situation for what it is and are just choosing a side, or are just not privy to any of this information. The fact that we can be staring at the United Nations numerous mandates saying that this has to happen, this is illegal, this is wrong, this is a war crime. And yet they'll say, we don't care. Simultaneously, we see the the United States and Israel, the governments of them, use mandates against their enemies every other day. So it's really ridiculous that people can't recognize that contradiction and see that there's a problem there, and that's something that really needs to stand out. So I would ask you then, knowing, in your perception and your how you see the situation, why do you think the U.S. government continues to just stand up and say, or not that, not illegal per se, as Mike Pompeo recently said? Like, how can they justify it, and why do you think they're still doing that in the face of all the obvious evidence?
Well, the United States obviously has its special relationship with Israel, and this is for a number of different reasons, whether it's lobbying groups or whether it's what they consider as strategic reasons inside of the Middle East, and forwarding their own initiatives. And this relationship has really been carrying on since President Lyndon Johnson. Of course, the June 1967 war was something which really strengthened that relationship. The United States didn't always used to be like this. It was a supporter of Israel, yes, but it wasn't so partisan at the start, actually. The United States actually, in I believe 1949, was going to place sanctions upon Israel because it wouldn't allow Palestinian refugees to return. And so the United States today, and the way we see it operate a lot of course, the United States government and its foreign policy specifically is pushed and controlled by neocons. And these neoconservatives basically see the Middle East as their playing grounds. And just look at what they've done in Iraq, look at what they did in Afghanistan, look at how they're aggressing against Syria and Iran. Look at how they're aggressing, especially economically now, against Lebanon. Look at what they're doing in Yemen. I can give numerous examples. And so when it comes to this, they see them as they're one in the same as the Israelis. And then, of course, they treat the Saudis in a very similar way as well. But the Israelis are especially close due to a number of different reasons. But it comes down to the same thing with the Saudis as well. If they have that relationship with them there, and these people inside of the United States government agree with the strategies that are being put forth, it doesn't matter what the Israelis or the Saudis or anyone else does, they will just take their side, because it's part of an ambition to basically not directly colonize, but to colonize the minds of and take over the governments of those in their region and pacify them. And so before in history, earlier on in what's deemed as the Israel-Palestine conflict, I just see it as an ongoing oppression and theft of land. But during this ongoing conflict, you had, the reactionary Arab governments, and then you had the Arab governments who were on the other side of the argument. But now it seems that you've got a string of Arab governments with where there's, sort of resistance movements within these different countries which are anti-Israel, but the rest of them are basically on side. I mean, Jordan's always pretty much been on the side of Israel. Egypt is on the side of Israel. Lebanon, the state isn't going to do anything against them. Syria does not want to aggress against Israel at this time. It's not looking to. And even though it's being bombed on a daily basis, and of course, Lebanese airspace is being infringed upon on a daily basis by Israel, they don't do anything. So Israel doesn't have this whole image now that, we're, under threat, like they historically claimed that they were under threat. There's a great book by a guy called Ze'ev Ma'oz, and I've actually got it here. He wrote a book called Defending the Holy Land, and he's out of Tel Aviv University, one of the universities in Tel Aviv. I can't recall exactly now. But he wrote an exhaustive volume, about 900 pages, on all of Israel's wars. And his conclusion was, and I'm paraphrasing, that all of Israel's wars were basically wars of folly and unnecessary. With all of them were not necessary wars for the existence of Israel, with the possible exception of 1948. And so this opinions are, it's around. It's not something that's controversial.
Absolutely. And yeah, it just simply takes the desire to look, the due diligence needed to actually look past the statements given by people who stand to benefit from those statements. It's very clear. And I think what, maybe you can touch on the refugee aspect, since you brought it up. And it's very clear that this is an ethno-state. I mean, what they're there's so many examples that this shouldn't, as you said, even be contentious. Openly stating this is for the state for the Jews alone. This is this is clear. This is directly from Netanyahu's mouth. So it's an interesting discussion to point out how the tie-in with groups like Saudi Arabia or Egypt, or just groups that are in that line. So how do you tie that in, and how do you see this? I mean, this is, in my opinion, one of the obvious examples for why they'll never, accept one of these deals that actually allows Palestinians to return, because that's the opposite of what their stated purpose is, right? So you can touch on that topic for me and how you see that going forward at all.
To address the point about Israel itself, it's absolutely based upon racial supremacy or ethnic supremacy, whatever way you want to phrase that. Because in of itself, calling itself a Jewish state on top of another people's land that's just ethnic supremacy. You can't have a state which is purely for one group of people on top of another people's land, kick them out, and then the remaining group of people there, you don't give them the rights and the same rights to self-determination and all the rest of this. And you arguing for that ethno-state is in of itself inherently racist. And I mean, this again is not a controversial thing, and I might refer to the United Nations, which actually ruled at one point that Zionism is a form of racism. That was overturned in 1991, I believe. And it was voted on in the 1970s and adopted in the 1970s. It was later overturned, but this is not a controversial issue. Israel is a racist state. It was established on top of other people's lands. And of course, the refugee issue is integral because lots of the people in the West Bank today as well are refugees. Most of the people in the Gaza Strip, about 75% of them are refugees. They've been expelled from other lands and pushed into this little enclave. of course, where there is, 97% of the water is undrinkable, 80+% of people depend upon foreign aid agencies in order to just get food. Hundreds of thousands of people are without a direct supply to any water line whatsoever. They get bombed in every few years in a major bombardment. Since the siege has been in, the siege is ongoing over 14 years now, which is completely illegal. Since then, there's been 8 large-scale military operations by Israel against the Gaza Strip, and there's been free what are deemed as wars. And all the time, they're going in and bombing people and killing people all the time. And so when we're looking at the refugee issue, most of the Palestinian people were pushed off of their lands in 1948, whether they were isolated into the West Bank, Gaza Strip, or what was deemed as being these present absentees is what Israel termed them. So people that remained inside of what became Israel, but were Palestinians and were expelled from their original villages. Most of them live in areas like the Galilee and Wadi Ara and different areas inside of what is now Israel. And so a just solution for Israel-Palestine, you have to include the refugees, because most Palestinians are refugees. Most of the Palestinian population, Muslims and Christians, are refugees. And so when you have a situation like this and you say that you don't acknowledge the right of refugees, and the Jewish refugees, as you claim, Jewish people who were pushed out 3,000 years ago, or whatever the claims are, 3,000 years ago, they were pushed out, and they have the right to come back at any time and claim Israeli citizenship based upon a Jewish grandfather or grandmother or whatever it is. But a Palestinian who was expelled, either between 1947 to 1949 in the first ethnic cleansing, about 800,000 people being expelled, or in 1967 where 350,000 people are expelled, they don't have that right. And this is recent, real recent. They still have the deeds to their homes, they still have the keys to their houses, and they're living in refugee camps in places like Lebanon or Syria, or they were pushed into Jordan. And the people in Lebanon, for instance, have no rights. They live like dogs. They don't have the same rights as Lebanese people. And the whole solution in this so-called deal of the century was to give them money and to try and get places like Lebanon to naturalize these people, but they're not. So the very most racist thing you can do is not only build a racist supremacist state on top of other people's lands, refuse to recognize their right to exist, refuse to recognize them as a state, physically want to push them out of existence and exterminate them and push them into the sea, literally in the case of Gaza. But hey, if you go into the sea in Gaza, then you're going to get gunned down after about 6 nautical miles if you try and go out. So you can't even escape like that, right? Not only is it all of these things, but on top of that, you're denying the people's identity. You won't even allow them to be Palestinians. You want them to be naturalized into Syria, into Lebanon, into Jordan, wherever else they may be, because you think that they're all Arabs and there's no difference between the Arabs. And if you've got a problem with that as well, we have to understand you can't have it, 2 ways. You can't have it both ways you want, because the European image for the Middle East through Sykes-Picot split up the Middle East in the way that they wanted to. The French, for instance, created Lebanon. They wanted it as like a Christian state there. They drew up the borders for the Middle East. The Middle East didn't used to look like that. There used to be a lot more unity, and people used to have their cultures in different areas. And you drew up the borders, and then you want to deny them of the right of who they are, which is it's incredibly racist.
Inherently. Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's no better example than that to show how they will fundamentally, they will say you with this exact same situation can come back and claim your heritage. You, because you're a different race with the same circumstances, cannot. There's no other word for that, right? I mean, that's very, very clear. You actually showed on your documentary a part that stood out to me where you were talking to a guy at a booth and you were asking him, like, but wait, so we can't walk on this street unless you're Jewish? And he said, yes, it's a settlement, only Jewish people. And you said, well, isn't that racist? And back and forth, it ultimately comes down to where he says, we don't care. I don't care. Nobody cares. It's like, perfect. Exactly.
We continued to film until we reached a military outpost, where we were at first instructed at gunpoint to go back because Palestinians could not walk on the Jewish-only street there. So we filmed secretly as I asked the soldier present why Isa and my cameraman Hamdi were not able to walk on the road.
You want to know the يعني Jewish
Settlement. But
It's not a Jewish people. The majority are Palestinian.
okay, so if it belongs only to Jews, then is this not racism? And so this is racism. And racism doesn't change depending upon where you go because of security situation. It's racism. That's it. Does that justify hurting them, killing them,
I don't
occupying them?
Nobody has them.
Crazy.
The soldier I just engaged with refused to speak to me until I told him I was not a Palestinian. But many other soldiers had an even more negative attitude towards us, making it clear that Palestinians or any friends of Palestinians were not welcome.
Yeah, it's just you know, they're psychopaths, and that's the only way I can really describe it. These people that think like this and see this as valid, that, you know, you can have about, in that place that you're referring to, that's called Al Khalil or Hebron, and there's about 300 to 400 settlers that live in the center of Hebron, or Al Khalil, as its name is in Arabic. And these settlers basically get all the rights they want. They can drive on roads when Palestinians can't drive on those roads. They've shut down Shuhada Street, which is the main street, which was, you know, bustling with business back in the day. And they just closed all the stores. People can't get access, pushed people out of their houses, stolen the homes, and locked it down. And it's a complete state of apartheid. But you ask a soldier, and a soldier will start going, oh yeah, but, you know, I don't really care. And that's a more liberal soldier, by the way. Other soldiers I've engaged with will not have that sort of a discussion with me. I won't get that far. And that soldier that I was engaging with there, himself, he said, are you Palestinian? And I said, no, I'm not Palestinian. And then he started speaking to me. He wouldn't speak to me. Like, he was like, you know, go away, go away. And then I told him I wasn't Palestinian. And then I started having that dialogue with him, and we secretly filmed it. And it's funny, though, because if you look at it as well, you know, about roughly, I believe, 60% of the Israeli Jewish population are actually of Arab origin themselves. And there's a big portion of Ethiopian Jews who live inside of Israel, and they're discriminated against too. And, you know, it goes even deeper than just, you know, Jewish people and Palestinian people. When it comes to inside of Israel, you know, you have all these different tiers of who's the best, with white Jewish people being on top. In a white supremacist state, you know, where that, you know, you have systematic discrimination against other groups of Jewish people as well, and that's heavily embedded there. And I've spoken with many Arab Jewish Israelis who have spoken to me and voiced their concerns about what's being done to them in the society and what's been done historically, for instance, with stealing Yemeni, like Arabs who came from Yemen, Jewish Arabs who came to Israel. They stole many of the babies, thousands of them. And I actually met somebody whose grandmother had a child stolen by the Israeli government to experiment on them. And they denied it for years. And people don't know about these things. People have never heard of, for instance, there's an Israeli Black Panther Party, which used to exist, and people don't know about that. So these issues are so, like, racism is just in the roots of the very project, you know, of Israel. It's a settler colonial project which was born out of Europe. And they came there to project this power onto this land because Jewish people weren't really accepted in Europe. There was obviously European anti-Semitism. The reaction to that was this secular ultra-nationalist movement, which came to come and steal Palestinian land. Because, again, the European view at that time of the Middle East was that these people were nothing. You know, they didn't exist. They don't have the same human rights as us. We can colonize them. We can take them over. And the difference between Israel and a lot of other Western countries is that inside of Israel itself, you know, Israel will present to Western countries that it has this forward-thinking ideology, but it doesn't. It's you know, there's very small pockets of, you know, left-wing Israelis. The society at large is, you know, far right in its ways of thinking. At least in other countries, we presented this image that we're not like we used to be in terms of our imperialism and wanting to go over and kill people and take their stuff. Israel is very open and brazen in its own society about it. It's only when it talks to the Western press that you will get people like, you know, Mark Regev or whoever, Netanyahu, will get up and we care about a two-state solution and all of this. Yeah, and then he's speaking to his own people and he's saying, we're going to bomb Gaza, kill them. You know, African people don't have the right to exist inside of Israel. And, we're going to go in an incursion in the West Bank and we will never recognize a Palestinian state. That's what he says to his base. We will always make sure the settlements stay here. That's what he's saying to his own people.
Right.
And, even when it comes to the West Bank, we're told that, the West Bank is the West. No. The Israelis have taken the West Bank. There's pockets of Palestine. This is how the Israelis view it. It's Judea and Samaria. That's the biblical name for it. And there's pockets of Palestinians which are a trouble there. They don't view it as Palestinian land. This is something very key. And in order to stop this, if we want to actually stop this from continuing to happen and building more settlements, being more deeply entrenched, then there has to be pressure on Israel. Israel's not going to concede anything. When there's a power that has everything, why would they negotiate with a people that have nothing to offer? They don't have, the Palestinians don't have the ability to project power over the Israelis. And so their demands are, Israelis are not going to turn around one day and go, yeah, we'll abandon our whole settler colonial project. We're going to include you as equal human beings. They're not going to do that. So there has to be sanctions applied upon Israel. Israel does have to be taken to the ICC. We do have to engage in things like BDS. We do have to delegitimize Israel's status and standing in the world as long as it maintains itself as this basically supremacist state where it's based upon racism and settler colonialism. And we have to think forward, and most Palestinians think towards this now, that we have to have a one-state solution with equal rights for all people. Whatever religion you're from, whatever ethnicity you're from, everyone has equal rights in the land. If Israel isn't made to concede to this, there will be more wars. There will be more killing. There will be more catastrophes. And it's such a simple thing to me, anyway, seeing that one state, the majority of the people between the river and the sea right now are Palestinians living inside of this land, right? And so the solution naturally should be that it's a democracy with equal rights. And you give away this idea of an exclusively Jewish state where only Jewish people have this, real status as human beings. It's basic universal values, in my opinion. It's not very controversial.
I completely agree. And I think that's why the kind of sub guys behind all this is to make it out. They're all terrorists. They won't know. They don't really say that as much as they used to openly because it's ridiculous, but they still kind of keep that in the moment. Oh, well, they're, like you see in the video, oh, well, there were stabbings and stuff over here. And there's more to the story, and there's a lot there. And what I find really interesting, you pointed out the mainstream media part. I'm constantly driving this home to people. Our own government will stand up, and a perfect example, and say they want a Palestinian state. And then Netanyahu will literally stand up and say, I will never allow a Palestinian state. And they'll present those two things as being the same. And it's amazing. And I think it's because we see the Israeli media wanting to kind of brag about it, like you said, to their constituency. Look, this is what we're doing because that's what they want. Whereas the other side, it's very different. And they don't want to perceive it as being authoritarian and imperialistic, but that's what it is. And I find this to be very interesting in regard to the current surge in this country in the United States about racism right now, that yet we cannot realize that one of the biggest issues in this regard is right there. And our own government is happily allowing it to happen. It's just weird cognitive dissonance. And you said psychopathy, being a psychopath. I really do think there's a level of psychosis here. Like that you cannot see these things, even from the level of people not being able to acknowledge that they're currently happening. Now, I wanted to ask you, in general, I know there's a lot in regard to this deal. I would argue the entire thing is a big facade, but what were for those that are new to this, what are some of the parts that really stood out to you as the most obvious parts that they're violations that make this a clear, open and shut case that this is violating the Palestinians or violating the deal in general?
Well, I'd go back to those final status issues. For one, for instance, putting final status issues aside, there won't be a Palestinian state. We'll have no borders with any other countries, right? It will just be these little Bantustans inside of Israel. It won't be contiguous whatsoever. There will be no contiguous real land. It's not going to be contiguous states. The Palestinians won't even have an army. They won't have an armed force. They'll be completely disarmed. That's what the agreement is supposed to be. And the Palestinians won't even be able to decide what they teach in their own schools. Okay. When it comes to the 5 final status issues, okay, because I spoke about the 4, what it was reduced to before, let's talk about the original 5. On Jerusalem, the Palestinians are completely robbed of their right to East Jerusalem as the capital. Completely robbed. It's off the table. No Masjid al-Aqsa, which is the Al-Aqsa Mosque is the third holiest site for Muslims in the world. They won't have access to those churches there if you're Christian. And so all those sites, you don't have access to it in your state. Your capital is Abu Dis, which is basically a suburb outside of mainland Jerusalem, which is still considered inside of Jerusalem, but it's on the other side of the apartheid wall, or separation barrier, as Israel calls it, even though it's built into Palestinian land. So Jerusalem's taken off the table for Palestinians. They don't have Jerusalem anymore. So that's one of those final status issues. Borders. Well, the Israelis decide where their borders are, and their borders are everything that doesn't have significant amount of Palestinians on them. They'll take the Jordan Valley, which is the Jordan Valley constitutes 30% of the West Bank and is the most fertile land, which is supposed to be for a future potential Palestinian state. And this land could be used for water extraction, urban centers, and agricultural projects. That's going to be completely taken away. Israel decides all the borders. Palestinians get no borders whatsoever with anyone. They don't control anything. When it comes to the refugee question, the refugees are kept outside and are not allowed to return to their homes. So the refugees, will be under this plan if it was to be followed, Donald Trump's plan. The refugees would be isolated to being naturalized into Lebanon and Syria, so they'd lose their Palestinian identity. When it comes to the issue of settlements as well, which of course are an absolute violation of the Fourth Geneva Convention, and international customary law, everything. These settlements, time and time condemned by UN resolutions. The last one was in 2016, which was against the settlements. Now, these settlements, the Israelis will get all of them. They won't have to abandon any settlements whatsoever. These are illegal settlements, so they get to take all the land for the settlements. And when it comes to water resources, and that's the fifth issue, the fifth original final status issue, they'll get no water. Palestinians currently have basically no access to their own water. They're not allowed to dig the wells in order to go far enough down to get any real water. The Jordan River was long ago diverted so that it went into the deserts, into the Nakab, and the Judean desert, and made the desert bloom, as they say. And in Gaza, the aquifer there has completely been destroyed. So Palestinians would get no access to water whatsoever. They still don't have the access to water. Israel steals all of the water and controls the water supplies, even to Ramallah, which is a major city center there. And the Palestinians are, for instance, Al-Haq, which is an NGO, found that Israeli settlers alone will get 6 times more water on average, and this is all the Palestinian population. Even this includes, statistics from the good areas inside of the West Bank, what's considered as the good areas, the well-off areas, right? Settlers get 6 times more water than Palestinians in their own land. And the water that the Palestinians get can be turned on and off by Israel. There's hundreds of communities inside of the West Bank which don't have direct access to water or electricity for that on that point. And so they have no access to it. So on all those final status issues, Palestinians lose out. No military, no real state, just Bantu stance. They don't have control over what comes in and out of their own country in terms of exports and imports. It will all go through Israel. Every part of their life will be controlled. There's no state. It's not a Palestinian state. And if you want that cemented even more, Netanyahu says it won't be a Palestinian state. He said we won't accept the Palestinian state. And Netanyahu is a proponent of the plan himself. So there is no Palestinian state which will come from this. This is the Israeli plan from what this is something key to explain. And I'm sorry I'm taking up too much time. But when it comes to the peace process, and this is very key, the only reason that we have the current situation that we do is because Israel wanted it. So, for instance, the Oslo Accords came about, of course, 1993. They were signed, and then there was this peace process, right? And we had the signing in 1995, and then all of these other accords, right? And talks, peace talks, so-called peace talks. When the Israelis approached the PLO, which was led by Yasser Arafat, for some sort of a peace solution, you have to look at it in its full context. Yasser Arafat was expelled from Jordan and then from Lebanon in 1982 when the Israelis came in and killed between 15 to 20,000 people. He was, not able to have direct access to the borders of occupied Palestine. And so the guerrilla movement wasn't getting as much attention as it once was. Yasser Arafat was in a very weak position as a Palestinian leader. Now, what happened in this period just before the Oslo Accords came about? The first Intifada, the first Palestinian uprising, as they call it, right? And this happened in 1987. In 1987, when that happened, the Israelis at one point had to deploy 300,000 of their military into the West Bank and Gaza Strip. This put, of course, an economic burden on them. This also made them open what they felt to be open to outside attacks. And also, this was a big PR disaster because, people were seeing this all over the television for the first time, Palestinian children throwing rocks at tanks. And they were killing lots of people. And so this was a catastrophe for Israel, and they needed a solution for this. So they went to the negotiating partner. The first official contact was made in 1988, which was a year later. And they came together with Yasser Arafat's PLO. They signed these Oslo Accords. And after the Oslo Accords, we had the creation of what is now, it's called the Palestinian Authority. Now, the Palestinian Authority is supposed to be an interim government, which is installed in West Bank and Gaza, but it only has control over the West Bank now. Hamas has control over Gaza until there is a real, Palestinian state created. But Palestinian state never came. And all of the agreements have been violated time and time again by Israel. They continue to put their settlers in there. So why did they get these Palestinians and this Palestinian movement to go in there and create this Palestinian Authority? If you look at the way that the West Bank is set up, and you look at the way that the Palestinian Authority have their control inside of the West Bank, it's set up into 3 different areas: Area A, B, and C. Now, Area C is under full Israeli military occupation, and the Israelis have full jurisdiction in all of it. They were supposed to withdraw within a 5-year period, subject to negotiations, but they didn't. There's Area B, which is under partial Palestinian control. And there's Area A, which is under supposed to be full Palestinian Authority control, but yet it's not. And in these areas, the Palestinian Authority security forces operate. They operate and where do they operate? In the major city centers where most of the Palestinian population lives. So in places like Nablus, places like Jericho, places like Ramallah, places like Al-Khalil, and different areas like this. And so the majority of the Palestinian people are situated in these areas. And those are the majority of the people that would be, uprising. These are big portions of the population which would be uprising. And the Palestinian Authority police control them. So they control the domestic situation. The Palestinian Authority gets funding from the United States, from Japan even, from the European Union. And so they pay the bills of the Palestinian Authority to do the dirty work, whilst the Israelis put in more settlers, lie to the Palestinian movement that it's going to create a Palestinian state, and keep seizing more and more and more and more land, more resources, everything. And the Palestinians are basically beating up, torturing, and arresting their own people, giving information about their own people to the Israelis so they'll come and arrest their children and all the rest of it. And that's why they were set up. They were set up there they control that domestic situation, quell uprisings, because a Palestinian can't throw a stone at their brother or sister in uniform who's just got the job because he wants some money. And he's joined the Palestinian police the way he can with an armed Israeli occupation soldier coming in. It's not the same thing. And when they control you, then you're not going to uprise. So they quelled the uprising. They created the first ever cost-free occupation, and they sold the entire world this lie that they wanted peace. And why do I say it's a lie from the very beginning? Because we can judge this based upon the context, based upon what we know, evidence on the ground, and statements from Israeli leaders saying they will never consider a Palestinian state, and the fact that the settlements they keep expanding. They keep bombing and killing Palestinian people, and they never give them any rights, or they never gesture towards even giving them any rights.
Yeah, absolutely. And you could and that's very interesting for people to consider, this kind of, Trojan horse idea that we have similar. You could make, and, this is a little bit more foggy, I would argue, but the idea of Hamas in the same way. You can show interesting ties there to some way that there was at least some influence there with the intention of justifying more action. Just the idea that that's something that happens, we have to be open to. And, to kind of finish up here today, I think this is really interesting to see how this is going forward and the interesting ties to right now, and maybe a little different, but say the idea, as you pointed out in your documentary, that Jared Kushner himself has open ties, or open is arguable, to illegal settlements right now, even though he's involved with the deal itself. So these are the things that are constantly popping up, and we need to be able to see this. And I argue that people just wouldn't even be aware of stuff like this if it wasn't for people like you showing them the reality. And that just needs to show us how cultivated and controlled all of this is, and has been and is to this day. And I think, for me, what ultimately makes a country, there's basic things, borders, as you pointed out, military, as you pointed out, trade, being able to trade, which this won't allow them to do, sovereignty, autonomy, which obviously does not exist within this so-called deal. It's about creating dependency, which is what they do with their foreign policy, which is what they're doing now. So thank you for being here today and really laying this out for everybody. Is there any other important parts? I know there's so much we could have gone over, but anything else you really wanted to leave anybody with today?
I would just tell people to look at the map of what apartheid South Africa looks like and put that together with the map that is presented by Donald Trump. And in reality, Palestinians will get even less land than this and have even less control over what that map looks like. And you tell me what it looks like to you, and you tell me what on a map that looks like to you. People have no rights. One group of people have complete and utter superiority. The other group of people have no human rights, have no dignity, have no freedom. Their right to exist isn't acknowledged. Their right to a state isn't acknowledged. Nothing about them is acknowledged. And you tell me what that is. If that's not racism and apartheid, I really don't know what is. Please tell me what it is, because it's pretty clear to me. This is the most blatant situation on earth. I mean, this situation here is clear cut. It's not very hard to understand what's happening here.
Yeah, well said. We can leave it with that. And I really just people that just keep an open mind, look at this stuff objectively, and stop being led by the nose by politicians, because that's ultimately what we see happening today. So thanks again for being here. I'll make sure and include all your social media links and your links to the documentary below. And as always, everybody, question everything. Come to your own conclusions. Stay vigilant.
This is the Defense Minister, Moshe Yaalon, talking just a couple of weeks ago. Israel is going to hurt Lebanese civilians, to include kids of the family. We went through a very long discussion. We did it then. We did it in the Gaza Strip. We are going to do it in any round of hostilities in the future. That's the Defense Minister. This is the Military Chief of Staff, Benny Gantz. The next round of violence will be worse and see this suffering increase. He headed up the military assaults on Gaza, the last two. This is the Minister for Education in the Netanyahu government. There will never be a peace plan with the Palestinians. I will do everything in my power to make sure they never get a state. He also said, if you catch terrorists, you simply have to kill them. I've killed a lot of Arabs in my life, and there's no problem with that. This is the Minister for Justice. Palestinians are all enemy combatants. This also includes the mothers of the martyrs. They should follow their sons. Nothing would be more just. They should go, as should the physical homes in which they raised the snakes. Otherwise, more little snakes will be raised there. That's the Israeli Minister for Justice in the last few months. The Israeli Deputy Minister for Defense. Palestinians are beasts. They are not human. The Minister for Foreign Affairs, CP Hotley, this is the last one. My position is that between the sea and the Jordan River, there needs to be one state only, the State of Israel. There is no place for any agreement of any kind that discusses the concession of Israeli sovereignty over lands conquered in 1967. Now, these are the official statements of several ministers of the current government of Israel. In one case, actually advocating genocide of all Palestinians, including children, and calling them snakes. Now, can I ask you, Taoiseach, do you not think that if we're defining terrorism, that is the language and thinking of terrorists, that it is absolutely unacceptable in civilized politics, in civilized international relations, for the heads of government of a state that we carry on normal relations with and who you met in Paris to advocate those sort of views when we know they have also led on to the deaths of thousands of Palestinians, innocent men, women and children. What have you to say, Taoiseach, about those sort of views being expressed by the Israeli government?